Imagine waking up in the morning and feeling a full spectrum of feelings swirling together in a way that even you can't always explain. A little sadness sitting right next to excitement, a bit of confusion wrapped in joy, and a sense of gratitude floating on top of an unshakable heaviness. It's like your emotional world doesn't operate in separate, neat boxes. Instead, everything overlaps and everything hits all at once. Today, we're breaking down the real science behind why some people feel so deeply, so quickly, and so all-encompassingly, and why it's far more fascinating and human than most assume. Emotional complexity. Psychology explains that some people don't experience emotions in simple, isolated pieces. Instead, their inner world functions more like a layered system, where several emotions can exist at the same time, overlapping, influencing each other, and creating combinations that are difficult to put into words. You might feel gratitude while also feeling a quiet sadness. You might celebrate a new opportunity but still feel anxious about the unknown. You might enjoy a moment of peace and yet sense unresolved tension beneath the surface. These experiences are signs of emotional complexity, a trait that makes your emotional system more nuanced and multidimensional than the average person's. People with emotional complexity process internal states differently. Their brain doesn't file feelings into separate folders. Instead, emotions interconnect and interact, meaning a single event can trigger multiple emotions simultaneously. This happens because emotionally complex individuals tend to have more active introspective systems in the brain. They reflect more, think more deeply, and analyze the meaning behind their experiences more intensely. Their internal narrative is rich, layered, and constantly evolving. While most people feel things in straightforward patterns, emotionally complex people feel in gradients. They feel sadness mixed with curiosity. They feel joy tied to nostalgia, hope, and a sense of vulnerability. Their emotions form blends instead of isolated signals. This depth can be both a strength and a weight. On one hand, emotional complexity is strongly linked to higher empathy, creativity, resilience, and the ability to understand the emotional experiences of others. People with this trait often connect deeply, love with intensity, and reflect with unusual clarity. They can sit with conflicting emotions without shutting down, and they recognize subtleties in situations that others overlook. Their emotional understanding is multidimensional, allowing them to perceive meaning in relationships, memories, and experiences that others interpret only on a surface level. But on the other hand, emotional complexity makes internal experiences heavier. A simple interaction can stay on your mind for hours because your brain analyzes tone, intention, and subtext. A small disappointment can feel more intense because your mind connects it to past experiences. A happy moment can pull old emotions to the surface because your brain makes links between moments automatically. Most importantly, emotionally complex individuals also struggle to explain what they feel because simplifying the emotions feels inaccurate. Trying to express a mixed emotional state using basic emotional language feels incomplete. This creates a sense of emotional overload where everything feels like too much and too vague at the same time. However, psychology clarifies that feeling multiple emotions at once is not emotional instability, it's emotional depth. It means your inner world has layers, context, and internal meaning. People with emotional complexity interpret things. Their emotional landscape is like a painting with many colors instead of a single shade. They may struggle to communicate their emotions clearly, but that isn't for lack of emotional intelligence. It's because their emotional experiences are too detailed to compress into small sentences, and while this can create internal tension, it also gives them a rare ability, the ability to understand themselves and others beyond the surface level. Alexithymia and hyperawareness. Psychology identifies two very different emotional processing styles that often lead people to feel overwhelmed or to experience too many emotions at once. Alexithymia and emotional hyperawareness. These two patterns appear to be opposites, yet they share a surprising similarity. They both create emotional intensity, but through completely different mechanisms. Alexithymia is widely misunderstood. Many assume it means a lack of emotion, but in reality, it describes a difficulty identifying, naming, or articulating emotions. People with alexithymia feel emotions strongly, but the emotions do not come with clear labels or explanations. In most cases, the emotional experience shows up as a vague internal heaviness or pressure. The person knows something is happening emotionally, but the brain struggles to separate the feelings into specific categories. This creates the experience of feeling everything at once, not because the emotions are complex, but because they are blended and unfiltered. It's like having several emotional sensations happening at the same time without the ability to map them or understand them individually. Moreover, psychology suggests that alexithymia can result from developmental experiences, emotional suppression during childhood, trauma, chronic stress, neurodivergence, or simply a brain that prioritizes rational analysis over emotional interpretation. For many people with alexithymia, emotions are experienced physically rather than mentally. The emotional experience is real, but the translation from feeling to understanding is disrupted. This can make the emotional world feel overwhelming because the person is experiencing intensity without clarity. On the opposite end of the emotional spectrum is hyper-awareness. Emotional hyper-awareness means someone not only feels emotions deeply, but also notices every shift, every nuance, every subtle signal in their emotional state. When others might feel a single emotion like stress, hyper-aware individuals perceive the entire emotional breakdown underlying that stress: worry, anticipation, hope, fear, self-doubt, excitement, and pressure, all at the same time. Their emotional awareness functions like a high-definition lens, magnifying everything they feel. When they experience emotions, they study them, interpret them, and analyze them constantly. This level of awareness can develop from heightened sensitivity, past trauma that trained the brain to monitor emotions closely, high introspection, or naturally strong emotional intelligence. Hyper-aware people tend to feel multiple emotions simultaneously because they detect emotional layers most people never notice. Something as simple as a conversation, a memory, or a change in environment can activate several emotional responses at once. Emotional hyper-awareness creates emotional richness, but it also creates emotional overload because the brain is processing more emotional data than the average mind. Now, the fascinating part is that emotionally overwhelmed individuals often exist somewhere between alexithymia and hyper-awareness. They might feel emotions intensely like someone with alexithymia, but have partial insight like someone who is hyper-aware. They might understand one or two emotions clearly while sensing several more beneath the surface that they can't fully articulate. This creates a confusing emotional experience. You know you're feeling a lot, but you can't fully sort or interpret the feelings. It becomes a mix of clarity and confusion. One emotion you can name, and several you can't. Psychology says both patterns of alexithymia and hyper-awareness can make someone feel like their emotional world is too crowded, too complex, or too intense. But neither pattern is a problem or flaw. They're simply different emotional wiring styles. People with alexithymia feel broadly, but interpret narrowly. People with hyper-awareness feel and interpret broadly. And those who fall in the middle experience life with emotional layers that they can sense, but not always understand. Emotional dysregulation is one of the most misunderstood aspects of human psychology. Many people assume that when someone reacts strongly, overreacts, or struggles to control their feelings, it's a character flaw or a sign of weakness. Psychology tells us something very different. Emotional dysregulation is not a moral failing. It's a natural consequence of how the brain processes, interprets, and manages emotions. Simply put, it happens when your emotional system becomes too reactive, too slow to return to baseline, or too inconsistent to navigate efficiently. People who experience emotional dysregulation often feel like their emotions have a mind of their own. A minor inconvenience can trigger intense frustration. A casual comment can spiral into hours of rumination. Joy can feel overwhelming, anxiety can feel paralyzing, and sadness can seem endless. This is not because the person is too sensitive or overly dramatic. It's because the brain's regulation system is not functioning optimally. In some cases, it's overactive. In others, it's underactive. And sometimes it's inconsistent, shifting unpredictably between extremes. Neuroscience explains part of this. Emotional regulation involves several brain regions: the amygdala, which detects threats and triggers immediate emotional responses, the prefrontal cortex, which interprets, reasons, and applies control, and the hippocampus, which integrates memory and context. In emotional dysregulation, the amygdala can become hypersensitive, reacting to perceived threats even when they are minor or imagined. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex may struggle to manage or suppress those reactions effectively, allowing emotions to dominate cognition. The result is emotional responses that feel automatic, intense, and often disproportionate to the situation. There are many triggers for dysregulation. Chronic stress, post-trauma, inconsistent caregiving during childhood, and even genetic factors can shape the brain to respond intensely to emotional stimuli. People who have experienced unstable environments often develop heightened sensitivity to potential threats, making the emotional system hypervigilant. Over time, the brain learns to prioritize rapid emotional response over calm reflection, creating patterns that persist into adulthood. But emotional dysregulation is not only about extreme reactions. It also involves difficulty returning to emotional baseline after an event. Someone may feel angry for hours after a minor argument or anxious for days after a small setback. This slow emotional recovery is a hallmark of dysregulation and contributes to feelings of exhaustion and overwhelm. In addition, dysregulated individuals may struggle with impulse control, relationship conflicts, or internalized shame, which further complicates their emotional landscape. Importantly, emotional dysregulation is not the same for everyone. Some people oscillate rapidly between extremes, while others experience emotions in a prolonged, intensified state. Both patterns are challenging, but the underlying principle is the same. The brain struggles to maintain equilibrium, and this is why emotional dysregulation often coexists with hyperawareness or alexithymia. If you are hyper-aware, the constant detection of emotional signals can flood the system, making regulation difficult. If you have alexithymia, the inability to label and organize emotions can create unintentional emotional overload. Fortunately, emotional dysregulation is not permanent. Therapy, mindfulness, and emotional skills training can strengthen the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate the amygdala, teach strategies for returning to baseline, and help people recognize patterns before they spiral out of control. Techniques such as labeling emotions, cognitive reappraisal, grounding exercises, and paced breathing can gradually retrain the brain to respond rather than react. Over time, even highly sensitive or dysregulated individuals can experience a calmer, more controlled emotional life without losing depth or authenticity. The key takeaway is this: emotional regulation is not weakness. It's a signal that your brain is working hard, interpreting signals in a high-intensity mode, and sometimes struggling to bring balance. With awareness, practice, and support, anyone can learn to navigate their emotional waves more effectively. Dysregulation does not define you. It is simply part of the process of understanding how you feel, why you feel it, and how you can respond with clarity, intention, and compassion. In every case, feeling everything all at once isn't a sign that something is wrong with your emotions. It's a reflection of how your brain processes emotional information. Some brains filter emotions heavily, some filter lightly, and some filter selectively. The experience of emotional intensity comes from the structure of your processing system, not from weakness or instability. People who feel everything all at once are emotionally wired in a way that picks up more signals, holds more feelings, and experiences life with more depth than the average mind. Meanwhile, psychology reveals something fascinating. People don't just differ in what they feel emotionally, but in how their brain processes and interprets those feelings. Two patterns often misunderstood, yet incredibly common, shape the emotional lives of millions of people: emotional blind spots, also known as alexithymia, and emotional hyperawareness. They exist on opposite sides of the emotional processing spectrum, and once you understand them, the entire landscape of human emotion starts to make sense. These are processing styles and ways the brain learns, reacts, adapts, and protects itself. Alexithymia is the invisible difficulty of not being able to identify your emotions clearly. It's not emotional numbness, it's not a lack of feelings, it's more like having emotional signals arrive in your brain without labels attached to them. You feel something, but the mind can't easily tell you what that something is. There's tension in your chest, restlessness in your stomach, pressure behind your eyes, but none of it translates into clear emotional language. People with alexithymia often describe their inner world as confusing or blank because their brain processes emotions more like physical sensations than mental experiences. This creates a delay or disconnect in emotional communication. While others seem fluent in the language of feelings, someone with alexithymia might genuinely not know what's wrong, even when they're overwhelmed. It's a neurological bottleneck. Emotional information enters, but it doesn't move smoothly through the system. The labeling system is slow, muted, or incomplete. And this processing style rarely comes from nowhere. Many people with alexithymia grew up in environments where emotion was unsafe, discouraged, or ignored. The brain learned, over time, to push feelings into the background. Others develop it through trauma, chronic stress, or neurodivergent wiring such as ADHD or autism. Their emotional world becomes less descriptive, less verbal, and far more sensation-based. They just struggle to translate what they feel into conscious emotional awareness. On the other side of the spectrum lies emotional hyperawareness, the intense and often overwhelming experience of feeling everything in high definition. These individuals don't just notice emotions, they absorb them. Their brain tracks tone, posture, eye movement, energy shifts, and even the unspoken emotions in a room. Their internal emotional antenna is always scanning, always picking up signals, always processing. This makes them extremely empathetic, intuitive, and perceptive, but also prone to emotional fatigue and overthinking. Nowadays, hyper-aware individuals often get labeled as too sensitive, but psychology shows they aren't choosing this intensity. Their brain processes emotional information rapidly and deeply, amplifying the volume of emotional experiences. Something small like an unfinished text, a slight change in someone's voice, a minor disagreement, can remain in their mind for hours. Their emotional world is vivid, colorful, and loud. With that vividness comes with pressure. Rumination, overstimulation, and emotional burnout become familiar companions. Just like alexithymia, emotional hyper-awareness is often an adaptation. Many hyper-aware people grew up in unpredictable environments where being able to detect emotional danger early was a survival skill. Others develop it through trauma, anxiety, or an overactive threat system in the brain. Their emotional radar becomes too sensitive, detecting signals that others miss, creating a world where emotions feel bigger and heavier than they objectively are. What's truly remarkable is that alexithymia and hyperawareness are not opposites, they're two forms of emotional dysregulation. The brain is either filtering too much or too little. One makes emotions hard to access, the other makes them impossible to escape. Both create confusion. Both create overwhelm. Both affect relationships, and both make emotional life harder to navigate without understanding the root cause. But psychology also identifies a third pattern, one that carries both ends of the spectrum, creating an even more complex emotional experience: inconsistent access to emotions. Some people are emotionally blind one moment and hyper-aware the next. They might feel nothing for days, then suddenly feel everything all at once. These individuals often describe themselves as unpredictable, overwhelmed, or disconnected from their own reactions. Over time, you may find what once felt overwhelming now becomes manageable. The confusion gives way to insight, and that emotional extremes no longer control your life. Embracing your unique emotional wiring allows you to respond to situations with more awareness, compassion, and intentionality. In the end, feeling deeply or struggling to articulate your inner world is an opportunity to develop mastery over the one thing you live with every moment: your own mind.